I use this?
Oh, no, that's fine. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Today I'll talk about Vault fast bootstrapping for the Algorand cryptocurrency. This is a collaboration with Adam Sewell, Yossi Jalad, and Nikolai Zeldovich. I completed this work when I was a student at MIT CSAIL, and I currently work for the company Algorand. So a cryptocurrency is initialized with an initial genesis state, and this state maps users to the amounts of money they own in the system. In this example, I own $5,000. Users can send money to each other by writing transactions and signing them with a cryptographic secret. Eventually, the cryptocurrency will batch groups of transactions into blocks. So in this block, I send my landlord a month of rent, and my advisor sends me a month of salary. Eventually, the cryptocurrency will confirm the block, applying this block to the old state, and this produces a new state. The new state will map users to their new balances in the system. So for a new user who has been listening to all blocks since the beginning of time, this user can derive the latest state by applying each block in sequence. However, a new user might not have been listening to all of these blocks and may only have the initial genesis state. How does this new user join the system? I'll call this problem bootstrapping, and it's the subject of my talk. One strawman approach is for the existing user to send the new user the latest state. Unfortunately, the new user has no idea that this is actually the correct state, and it's not some maliciously corrupted version of the state. In Bitcoin, the existing user will send over the entire history of all blocks. This new user will compute the latest state by applying each block in sequence and deriving the latest state according to the rules. Unfortunately, the sequence of blocks may be enormous, and the latest state may also be enormous. So our goal today is to securely and efficiently enable a new user to join a cryptocurrency, given that this user has obtained the initial state. To do this, we need to minimize two components. First, we need to minimize the state that's transmitted to the new user. And second, we need to minimize the size of the proof that the state is valid. Our contribution today is the design of Vault, a system that allows a new user to securely and efficiently bootstrap to the latest state. Vault introduces 3 new techniques for optimizing this bootstrapping process. Our evaluation shows that for a new user in Vault, this user must only download less than half a gigabyte of data to bootstrap to a system containing 500 million transactions. For a user in Bitcoin in a similar setting, this user needs to download almost 150 gigabytes of data. Vault's first technique is that it garbage collects old state that's no longer necessary for operating the cryptocurrency. This could enable an attacker to replay transactions, so Vault forces all transactions to expire, which decouples the detection of these attacks from the tracking of user balances. Vault's second technique is that it shards state, so that each user only needs to hold a small portion of the entire state. The challenge here is that a shard that's only held by a few users may not be very secure, so Vault uses an adaptive Merkle tree sharding scheme that allows any user to verify any transaction in the system, even while holding a single shard. Finally, Vault compresses the history that proves the latest state is valid. Vault needs to do this in a way that prevents an attacker from tampering with the history. So Vault introduces the notion of succinct certificates, which are a short and secure proof that the state is valid. For this talk today, I'll focus on our third technique, and I'll refer you to the paper to read about our other 2 techniques. I'll begin by providing some context behind our work. Vault is built on Algorand, which is a permissionless and proof-of-stake cryptocurrency. Algorand is permissionless because any user can join the system at any time, and Algorand is proof-of-stake because the amount of power a user has in a system is proportional to how much money he controls. At all times, Algorand produces a cryptographic proof that the state is valid. And Algorand does this under the following security model. First, we assume that standard cryptographic primitives, such as hash functions and digital signatures, exist. Second, we assume that the new user knows the initial state, in other words, the genesis state. And finally, we assume that no more than 1/5 of the money in the system is controlled by an attacker. How do we prove a block correct? In this diagram, the cylinder labeled S1 refers to state 1, which is the state corresponding to block 1, and the square labeled B2 is block 2. The users in this diagram correspond to users who own money in the system as of time state 1, and the red users correspond to malicious users controlled by the attacker. One way we could prove block 2 to be correct is simply to have all users sign block 2. A supermajority of signatures on block 2, weighted by the stake of the signer, the amount of money he controls, is called a certificate. And this certificate forms a cryptographic proof that block 2 is indeed the correct block. Unfortunately, Algorand tries to scale to millions of users, and waiting for 1 million signatures is not tractable in a practical system. So to solve this problem, Algorand samples from the entire population of users some subset of users. And it is this subset of users that signs the block on behalf of the entire population. The probability that any given user is picked in this sample is proportional to the amount of money this user has. In addition, the threshold of signatures required to form a valid certificate is set so that with overwhelming probability, an attacker does not control enough signatures to forge a certificate for an arbitrary block. One more detail I'll talk about briefly is that in Algorand, the users in state 1 do not sign block 2, but instead actually sign some block in the future. This behavior is parameterized by this variable I'll call the delay, and it's necessary in order to prevent a certain class of network attacks. I'll refer you to the paper on Algorand by Yossi Jalad and others for a more formal treatment of this parameter. So we can use this proving mechanism to build a bootstrapping mechanism. Suppose a new user has downloaded and verified the first 3 blocks. This new user then sees a certificate for block 4. In order to verify that each signer in block 4 was actually selected to sign block 4, this user will read its balance from state 1. Here, for illustrative purposes, the delay parameter is 3, but in practice, it can be much larger. Once the user has verified the certificate for block 4, the user can trust block 4. Likewise, the user uses the balances from state 2 to verify the certificate for state 5. In this way, the user downloads and applies every block in sequence to compute the latest state. The certificates here produce a cryptographic guarantee that each intermediary block and each intermediary state is also valid. How much does this process cost? The size of a certificate is about 1 megabyte, and depending on the number of transactions in the system, the size of a block is also around 1 megabyte. Unfortunately, a new user needs to download every block and every certificate in order to bootstrap, and this process is very expensive. Vault compresses this history that proves that the latest state is correct. Vault does this using 2 techniques. First, Vault allows new users to skip blocks, and second, Vault shrinks the sizes of certificates that prove that a block is valid. First, I'll talk about how Vault enables a new user to skip blocks. Recall that every state enables the new user to verify a state 3 blocks in the future is correct. If you look carefully, state number 7 requires state number 4 to verify, and state number 4 requires state number 1 to verify. Using this observation, we can have the user skip all the blocks in between. This user only needs to download every 3rd block and every 3rd certificate. However, if you look carefully, the user has skipped blocks 2 and 3, so he does not know what the balances in state 4 are. And these balances are important because this allows the user to verify state 7. To solve this problem, Vault adds to each signature a Merkle proof of the signer's balance. In addition to committing to the block, the Vault certificates also commit to a block header, which contains the Merkle root that's used to verify these proofs. Thus, the proof that the latest state is correct is a sparse sequence of headers and a sparse sequence of certificates. And in order to bootstrap, the user only needs to download the sparse sequence and the final state. Unfortunately here, because we added Merkle proofs to each signature, the certificates are now 10 times larger. So now I'll describe how Vault shrinks the sizes of certificates that prove that a block in the state is correct. To do this, we need to revisit our sampling mechanism. So recall that a certificate is a threshold of signatures from some stake-weighted sample of the entire population of users. Therefore, the size of a certificate is a product of two factors. First, the expected size of the sample, and second, the threshold of signatures needed to make a certificate as expressed as a proportion of the sample. In order to shrink the size of the certificate, Vault greatly shrinks the size of the sample. However, a smaller sample is less representative of a population. And in particular, the proportion of malicious users in the sample will now exhibit a higher variance. So to compensate for this effect, Vault needs to raise the threshold of signatures needed to form a valid certificate. For example, it might raise the proportion from 75% to 90%. And the upshot of this is that there might not be enough honest users at a given point in time to meet the threshold to make a certificate. The key observation of my talk, and our key insight in this technique, is that failing to form a certificate while bootstrapping is completely acceptable. It is permissible for the bootstrapping mechanism to trade off the certificate availability for the certificate size as long as the certificates remain secure. This is true because the underlying system will guarantee a high degree of availability, so the new user can always fall back to this underlying system. We quantified the trade-off between certificate size and certificate availability. We found that a certificate with 100 signatures is 74 times smaller than an Algorand certificate, and it fails to form about 2/3 of the time. So now that we've shrunk the certificates and the certificates can fail, our bootstrapping algorithm needs to deal with these failures. And we're going to use the hashes of previous block headers to bypass failures. So suppose a new user has downloaded a block header and a block certificate for block 5. This new user would like to download the certificate for block 8, but due to an availability failure, this succinct certificate actually does not exist. So Vault uses an innovative, disruptive, transformative technique of putting in each block header the hash of the previous block header. This allows the user to efficiently verify that the block header for block 4 is valid, and use this to verify the certificate for block 7, and thus the certificate for block 10. Observe that this allows this new user to vault over the failing certificate for block 8. The advantage of this approach is that in the common case, the user will not have to download any large certificates and can only download the succinct certificates in order to bootstrap. In the unlikely case, or due to network problems, all succinct certificates might fail to form, so the user will just fall back to the large certificates that were produced by Algorand. Now I'll talk about how we evaluated our system. We simulated a trace of 500 million simple transactions on a prototype of the data structures in Bitcoin, Ethereum, Algorand, and Vault. For Vault, we use all three techniques: transaction expiration, adaptive sharding, and our succinct certificates. We set the delay parameter to be 1,000, and we set the number of shards to also be 1,000. And then we measure the data transferred to bootstrap a new client. You can see in our evaluation that to bootstrap to Bitcoin, a user needs to download over 100 gigabytes of data. And this is because the user needs to download every single transaction that happened in Bitcoin. The basic bootstrapping scheme I described in Algorand will add another 50 gigabytes of data transfer cost because the user needs to download the cryptographic proofs that the blocks are correct. In Ethereum, users do something a little more clever, and they download the entire sequence of block headers in addition to the final state. This is advantageous, and so the limiting factor here is the size of the state that the user downloads. And that forms the bulk of the bootstrapping cost. Vault is the only system we evaluated that allows a new user to bootstrap to a system of 500 million transactions by downloading less than a gigabyte. And this is because the new user only needs to download a very small shard of the entire state. Moreover, Vault preserves the cryptographic guarantees that the Algorand certificates provided. I'll briefly mention some related work for some context. The Lightning Network, EDRAX, and OmniLedger are all approaches that minimize the size of the state that's required to operate the cryptocurrency. Mimblewimble and Chainiac introduce techniques for minimizing the proof that a state is correct. These pieces of research all address bootstrapping problems, but they do so under a different security model and with different assumptions and in a different setting. One important thing to note is that in a permission setting, bootstrapping is trivial because all you need is a supermajority of the permissioned users to checkpoint the latest state. In conclusion, bootstrapping costs are a fundamental bottleneck that prevent cryptocurrencies from scaling to millions of users. Vault's techniques address these costs, and in particular, the succinct certificates in Vault securely compress the history of the state by trading off availability of the certificate for the size of the certificate. Our evaluation shows that Vault reduces the cost of bootstrapping to a system to less than half a gigabyte of data transferred. This is lower than Ethereum by about 90.5% and lower than Bitcoin by about 99.7%. Thanks for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Hi, I'm Saurabh from IIT Delhi. So in your evaluation, you have shown that Vault requires around 500 MBs of data for bootstrapping. Like, I want to ask, have you considered adversarial presence while evaluating your Vault? Like, what was the fraction of adversary in the population when you evaluated your data? Because if I understand correctly, if you have adversary, then you have to download more data.
Right. So in our evaluation, the figure here shows a common case where there are no attacks. However, note that even an attacker who is actively trying to sign certificates for bad blocks do not actually affect the bootstrapping costs. The thing that affects the bootstrapping costs is something that would prevent the certificates from forming. And the factor that would prevent a succinct certificate from forming would be a network outage, which would prevent the honest users from actually being able to aggregate these signatures.
Thank you.
Pascal Baron from NIMIC. So in this graph, it seems that the size of data the users have to download sometimes with more transactions is less than with less transactions. How does this happen?
For Vault? Yeah, excellent question. Recall that the vaulting algorithm is probabilistic in nature. There's a possibility that the set of users that are selected is not large enough to actually form the certificate. And so actually, and I'll go to a backup slide here, therefore the size of the proof that this state is correct is very noisy and shows a lot of variance. And so that's the cause of this bumpiness. In an absolute sense, the variance is actually very small. So, and as the cryptocurrency gets more history, it becomes even a smaller fraction of the total cost.
Okay, thanks.
Bing Shen from Lancaster University. Thanks for the talk. I'm wondering what is the actual size of the amount of people you sampled, for example, 100 or 300 in the certificate, for example, shrink the certificate, and how do you incentive them?
Yeah, okay, so the size of the, the size of the, I'll go back to the slide here. Yeah, so the threshold at which the certificate is valid is about 100 users. And the sampling mechanism will select about 120 users in expectation. And so now, if you recall, about 20% of the users we assume to be malicious. So the The probability of enough honest users being selected by chance and being able to create the certificate is about 33%.
How do you incentive them
I don't understand your question. How do I incentivize users to?
to sign?
Oh, I see. This is it's a great question. It's out of scope a little bit for this work, and I could provide you a more interesting answer offline.
Sorry, so you mentioned actually
Yeah.
33%. So with 33% of the chance, we can form a certificate. Otherwise, we fail.
Yes, that's right.
That's very, very low. So basically,
Exactly.
the graph you are showing need to multiply by 3, roughly. In
Which
terms
graph
of
I'm showing?
The performance at the end. Because on average, you are going to expect 2/3 of the certificate will not be formed.
So that graph actually takes the failures into account.
Thanks.
That's why it's bumpy. Yeah.
We are running out of time a little bit. Just one quick question.
Okay, yeah, I can do a quick question. So in your system, you have users sign blocks that are a few blocks ahead in the chain. What were your kind of considerations for deciding how far ahead that user should actually be signing these things?
That's an excellent question. There's more details in the paper, but we trade off between two securities assumptions. First is, and there's a little bit more detail in the paper, is the size of network partitions that Algorand is expected to be resilient against. And the second parameter is the rate at which honest stake becomes malicious after they've sold out of the system. So you need to balance between these two trade-offs in order to select an optimal delay for vaulting. Thank you very much.
Let's thank Derek again. Our next speaker